Thanks to Jack and to Bryn and to everybody at the RecruitiFi team. Let me start by just saying a very brief word or two about Blackrock. We are a large, diversified asset management firm. We currently manage in the region of $4.7 trillion in assets for our various clients around the world. We have about 12,000 employees. Our client base covers a total of 100 countries. For me, it's just interesting sort of perspective. A lot of people who've been at Blackrock for a long time have seen the firm grow and grow and are sort of really struck by, in their view, how large it's become, because they remember a point in time when there was only a few hundred people. For me, I spent 16 years of my career at Goldman Sachs, and Blackrock's a third of the size of that. So for me, it's actually a pleasing sort of step down in terms of scale to an organization you feel like you can get your arms around a little bit. I'll talk very briefly about our talent agenda and how recruiting fits into that. Our talent agenda is really sort of shaped and steered by a group of senior leaders that we call the Human Capital Committee that is responsible, as you see here, for focusing on all matters pertaining to people, talent, and culture, and talent development globally. The talent agenda of Blackrock is very, very high profile and gets a lot of senior leadership attention, as you can tell from this picture. And that feeds into a picture of our HR objectives for the year. I don't think there's anything particularly revolutionary or different about these, but obviously this gives a little bit of context to what we're trying to do from a recruiting and a hiring capacity. Let's drill down a little bit and sort of lift the lid on Blackrock Recruiting in 2014. So through our lateral recruiting channel, we filled a total of about 2,500 positions. That includes a bunch of a considerable number of internal fills, but that is a lot of activity. You can see we had time to fill there that I would characterize as okay, not exceptional. I mean, I would say that on average our roles are, they're relatively individual. As I was saying to Britain before, we don't necessarily get the benefit of a ton of economy of scale where we have to hire 50, 60, 70 of the same kind of person. Each of the positions we recruit for tends to be, at any given time, tends to be rather unique. And we were seeing throughout 2014 that in a sort of unconstrained environment, as the firm was looking at fairly significant headcount growth, we were typically carrying a global active requisition load of about 720 to 750. And we had a recruiting staff of about 30 lateral recruiters worldwide. Now there's more people in the equation there. We have recruiting coordinators, we have some sourcing capability, but 30 recruiters covering clients for their recruiting needs. Okay, so it was a high volume, very challenging, very difficult environment as we try to work to meet the needs of our business. Now, this is my assertion here. Recruiting, in my opinion, is the least scalable of all HR activities, meaning if you've got to hire twice the number of people, then it's effectively twice the amount of work effort. As a recruiting system gets progressively more stressed by volume. In a light volume scenario, recruiters can divide their time in a reasonably balanced way between these three different phases of a search process. Okay, initiation, the middle part, sourcing and screening candidates, and the back end of working on offers and closing candidates. And that's sort of a pretty ideal scenario. When you start to stress the system a little bit with volume, in my experience, recruiter attention sort of gets pushed to the beginning and the ends of the process, because in many respects, those are the most time sensitive. Hiring manager was very anxious to get their role posted, start seeing resumes. They've just had somebody leave in a critical coverage area, so that part is super time sensitive. Similarly, at the other end of the process, when they've got a candidate and they want to hire them, that part is very pressing too from a time standpoint. And so given the sort of the lack of elasticity that typically exists in most internal recruiting functions, the only place sort of left to give back a little bit is that middle part. That is a less time sensitive item. It's in certain respects a little bit more discretionary, and what it means is that recruiters are able to spend less and less time actually going and finding and qualifying and screening candidates. And then as volume gets to really high levels, the attention gets pushed further and further to the back end. The business to some degree is sort of through one means or another finding more and more of their own candidates and just keeping up with pushing offers out at the pace that the clients want. means that the distribution of time starts to look more like this. It's just a directional picture. So you can see tremendous downward pressure on how much time recruiters can actually spend finding candidates, and the role becomes a little bit more about sort of offer administration and search administration. The value add to the business goes down and down, and frankly the career experience for the recruiter and the opportunity to really add value to the clients tends to go down and down. If you think about just the math of it, at times in our organization, and certainly many other organizations I've either worked in or been familiar with, you've seen recruiters carrying 30, 40 requisitions at a time, sometimes more. You think about what that means, just some basic math. That means if a recruiter is sort of working a solid 50-hour work week, back out a few hours for what they spend in team meetings and non-recruiting activity, essentially means they have about an hour a week to spend on any given search. That is a pretty tough value proposition to bring to your clients. I mean, you're going to go to a pitch meeting or an intro meeting with a client, say, we're really excited to work on this new search you've had opened up. I know it's super critical to you to find somebody really quickly, and I know it's really business priority. So the good news is we're going to spend an hour a week on this search for you. Okay, we're going to give this everything we've got. But don't worry, but 3 months from now, we'll come back to you. And by that time, we'll have spent the equivalent of about a whole working day on this. And do you have any questions? I mean, just on the face of it, right? Just some simple numbers. That's kind of a tough sell. So what we really started to think about was, instead of being in this sort of fundamentally unconstrained environment where businesses, provided they had the budget, could initiate whatever searches they wanted at whatever time, whatever scale, and as a recruiting team, you never could really figure out what was coming just around the corner. We figured, well, what if you could somehow manage and manage to a fixed level the amount of recruiting activity that took place at any given time? So if you have the opportunity to fix the activity level, then you have an opportunity to sort of design a fixed service level that you feel you can consistently deliver, right? Whereas if the volume keeps going up and up, your service level goes down and down, as we discussed over the last few pages. And if you can do that, then perhaps there's a chance to enable your recruiters to focus more on some of these things that are higher up in the sort of value add chain. So instead of just being offer administrators and doing sort of lower level work, and by the way, in some cases being paid rather good paychecks to do what ends up being very low level administrative work a lot of the time, maybe you can allow your recruiting team to focus on delivering some of these much more valuable items to the clients. Well, we thought about it this way. We said, look, we have about 30 recruiters worldwide. We also know that the business doesn't particularly want to just sort of keep adding more and more recruiting resource and potentially have situations where we grow and we shrink and we grow and we shrink. We don't really want to embrace that. But if we take 30 recruiters and we try and come up with some reasonable number of active requisitions that we think a recruiter can handle at any given point in time, given all of the other infrastructure around them, that would enable them to deliver against some of these objectives we spelled out here, then we can kind of work out what we think our optimal level of recruiting activity should be as a firm at any given point in time. And so looking at a little bit of industry benchmarking, we worked a little bit with the corporate executive board and certain other forums. We basically, and just sort of thinking about it for reasonableness, we hit on the number 18. Okay, we figured we think that we can deliver against some of those strategic objectives if our recruiters are averaging out at a rec load of about 18 at any given point in time. And so we said, okay, if 18 is a reasonable number, and we've got 30 people, then that means collectively as a function, we think we can carry about 540 active searches globally at any given point in time. Okay? So far, so good. Now, the trick becomes, how do you then sell that to the business? Okay? There are a couple of important components to that. As with anything else, you're never going to sell anything to the business by explaining to them how they can help you out in HR to have a better life and help your people. You have to position it in the context of how whatever it is you have in mind is going to be beneficial to them. And so we said, look, here's what we're asking you to do. We are asking you to prioritize your searches. Okay, in other words, decide which ones you want to have worked on actively right now. And as those get filled, you'll open up additional ones over the balance of the year. And so by the time the year is done, we'll have managed to complete all of your hiring. But the benefit to you is we're actually giving you the control over what really gets worked on and focused on. Because right now, we already have a prioritization mechanism in place. As a practical matter, it's called the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And when a recruiter is carrying far too many searches to be effective across all of them, I think we all know what happens is that the hiring manager that's pounding the table the hardest is the one that gets focused on first. That may or may not comport with the priorities of the business in terms of what they consider to be their most important positions, the ones that have to get attended to first. And so we modeled it out. We figured that we could average out at a blended time to fill of around about 90 days. You may remember those figures from a little bit earlier in the deck here. And we figured if we could deliver against that, then we could allow that 540 active search number to turn over about 4 times during the year. Okay? And that, it turns out, would be enough to get the hiring job done. And so, here's the second component. So first we had to try and convince the business that ultimately this would be in their interest. The second part, truthfully, was having credible HR leadership with influence at the top level of the firm. This is not something that we could just sort of do on our own autonomously. We had to engage with the firm's COO, one of our senior most leaders who understood what we were trying to do, understood that this actually might produce certain helpful best practices in terms of how hiring went. And through him, we ultimately sold it to the Global Executive Committee, which is the senior most governance body in the firm that runs everything at Blackrock. Now, were there some questions? Yeah, there were some questions. We had a few good discussions with a number of hiring managers and certain businesses that had concerns. But ultimately, it's worked out very well, as I will explain in a second. I'll just spend a second here, though, just talking a little bit through the math of how we did things. So I explained before that we figured we could carry 540 active searches at any given point in time. So we looked at each business's hiring plans for the year. And for any given business, we said, look, based on your hiring plan, you're going to account for about 9%, I'm making this up, but you're going to account for about 9% of the firm's total hiring activity. Therefore, you can have 9% of the available active recruiting slots, okay? And that's going to be your allocation. And let's say, that works out to whatever that works out to, 45 maybe. So you decide which 45 searches you want worked on today. We'll go work on them. And as we fill those, you decide what the next most important is in line, and we'll, as each one rolls off, you'll open up that one. And as I said, there was a little bit of skepticism. But what's been really interesting as we've worked our way through this is that our performance has gone up considerably. So first, we've seen much more sustainable requisition loads for our recruiters, which we've been reasonably tightly managed to an average of 18 per, instead of going to runaway numbers. We've seen better organizational discipline on the part of the firm. So in the past, when hiring managers could effectively open as many positions as they had budget for, we also found that a lot of those searches tended to languish. Hiring managers were not engaged, they weren't responsive, weren't really paying attention. Well, now, a senior business manager within each business unit is managing that business's allocation. And if there's a hiring manager that's not paying attention or moving the ball forward on their particular search, they can put that on hold and let somebody else activate a search that they want to activate. So what that's meant is that hiring managers have been much more dialed in and much more engaged on their searches if they're active, which has tended to move them forward more quickly. And as we've measured things going through, we sort of put this in place in about January, and as we've measured things over the course of the year, we've actually found that our recruiting velocity and output has gone up. And so the absolute number of hires we've generated has actually been higher, even though we've been carrying a lighter rec load. Our time to fill has gone down by about 25 to 30%, which is a meaningful decrease on where it had been in 2014. Yeah, so the sort of an important part of the governance structure in our firm is that at some level you can sort of divide the firm up into about 20 different business channels. And each of them has at the top of it, or near the top of it, a COO in BlackRock parlance. And so that's a senior business manager, senior administrative manager in that area. That's the person who has the responsibility of determining what searches get worked on and prioritized within that business. So as I've continually had to point out to my team, we actually don't make the decisions on what searches get activated. That's not our job. The business makes those decisions. And if you're a hiring manager with 2 roles that you want to fill, then it's your prerogative to make your case to the COO atop your business, but they then decide in the wider context of all the hiring that has to go on in that business whether your 2 searches rank at the top or not. We've sort of made ourselves officially agnostic on what gets worked on. We let the business make that decision. Interesting that we've seen really good results in terms of velocity, in terms of output. I will say, in the sort of challenges box, we've certainly seen an increased sense of urgency on the part of some hiring managers. They're very keen to sort of complete searches so they can activate the next one. And we've certainly had our antennas up for any sort of unintended consequences of that. We definitely don't want people making hasty hiring decisions or compromising quality for the sake of speed. As far as we can tell, that has not been happening as much as we've kept a close eye on that. There's been a certain increase in operational burden, just sort of making sure that we are working with our business partners to sort of track the number of active searches they've got versus their cap or their limit. And certainly, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that diversity has been an important strategic talent consideration for us, and so we've also wanted to make sure that we're not compromising the effort to build and find diverse candidate slates on each search simply because we're rushing to fill roles. And as it turns out, our diversity outcomes have been at or above last year's numbers, so that's been quite pleasing too. Some of our takeaways from this were, I think in the back half of last year when we all sort of had our hair on fire and we're just trying to keep up, I don't know that we would have necessarily assumed that we could make anything like this happen. But we were fortunate to get great leadership support both within HR and ultimately within the firm at large. As I explained before, we really tried to sort of commercialize the discussion and not make it something that was about serving the interests of HR, but make it something that actually served the needs of the business. We certainly had to communicate a lot on what we were doing, so we definitely appeared at numerous different forums and leadership groups to communicate what we were doing and why. We were very keen that the business, particularly individual hiring managers, understood that we were actually trying to enable more in the way of commercial pragmatism rather than place obstacles and roadblocks in the way of people hiring. But we've had to try and be flexible and pragmatic too, and sort of point 4 here. So for example, one particular group got agreement to convert a considerable number of contingent worker positions into permanent headcount, which had the effect of them needing to hire a lot more people than we had originally anticipated at the beginning of the year. So we ultimately reached agreement with them that they were going to add and fund a couple of contract recruiters that we added to our team to give them more capacity to get that done. Happily, the firm is also in the process of sort of architecting some of our corporate systems around the concept of managing this prioritization process, so that there's going to be better reporting and better workflow in behind it for the management teams and the recruiting teams. So that leaves us feeling pretty good that combined with the results that we've seen should hopefully mean that this is a mechanism that's here to stay as we move forward. Thank you.